History is full of amazing stories and memorable people.
But we don't care about them.
No hits, deep tracks only.
Some of the most influential people in the world have been completely overlooked or just plain forgotten.
We're digging deep into the history books to bring you their stories.
I'm Phil.
And I'm Matt.
We're not historians. We're just two guys who enjoy a great story and plenty of laughs.
This is History's B-Side.
Today's B-Sider is the unsung hero of the Tulsa Race Riots.
So I wanted to start today's episode just with, I guess, a lighter-hearted conversation about information, especially information that's passed word of mouth, because today's episode is largely going to be about the Tulsa Race Riots, and a lot of what caused the race riot to start and to get as destructive and violent as it did was word of mouth rumors, and a lack of credible sources to kind of contain those rumors. But I guess I wanted to start by asking you, Phil, is there ever a time when you found that rumors or false information led to an unnecessary or false overreaction to something that could have been avoided?
Well, not to compare like the Tulsa Race Riots to something that's obviously a lot more trivial, but like it all seems very high school to talk about that kind of topic. Like,
yeah,
that's where a lot of the drama or personality conflicts that we all went through when we were teenagers kind of stems from, just people who maybe spread rumors or don't fully know the situation and start talking. And I mean, you see a lot of that in adults today too.
Totally.
But it just feels like a very adolescent type reaction to almost anything to spread misinformation.
Do you, I'm kind of going off script a little bit, but what are your thoughts on gossip? Like, do you gossip? Do you participate in it? Do you listen to it?
I mean, I probably would say that I don't, but I'm maybe not as social as I was, back when I was in school.
Sure.
Because I pretty much just go to work and then go home. I don't know. I don't think I was ever really a gossiper. I will say when I worked at Panera and it was a whole bunch of female managers and me, whenever there were those kind of like personality conflicts between them, I always found myself to be sort of in the middle because I'd hear both sides if there were sides complaining about the other. And it was just kind of like, I've heard their side, I've heard your side. I don't necessarily agree with either one of you, so I'm just going to keep my mouth shut because that'll keep me out of trouble.
Yeah.
But even like, I guess from a more recent example, as far as like rumors and false information, like I obviously work with a, pretty public company and I deal with a lot of the social media and stuff on that end. So I do see some instances where, people tend to run with things when they maybe don't know the full situation.
Yeah.
And, I'm not here to say that they're 100% wrong or that like, we don't make mistakes or other people don't make mistakes. And you see a lot of that in the public eye, especially on social media today.
Right.
But things tend to escalate very quickly with people who share and repeat things that maybe don't know what really happened.
Totally.
And social media is like gasoline on the fire when it comes to something like that.
No, it gives us this kind of like super speed highway for information, good or bad. And I've definitely found, just in reflecting over the last several years of my life, that I've grown a little bit in the way that I respond to certain things. I think in the past, and still probably to this day to a certain extent, I, like many people, respond emotionally to certain things and have an immediate, knee-jerk reaction. But it's
hard not to when you have something that like you care and you're passionate about. And I mean, there are very passionate people that have a lot of opinions on things like that. And I get why people are so quick to hit the share button or to repeat things that they've heard, whether it's online or offline. But, it's never really good to spread things or repeat things
Right.
unless you really are familiar with the situation, or if you're even involved in it. Like if it doesn't involve me, I tend to just be like, okay, whatever, and then move on with my day.
Yeah. Well, and I think, like, in a way, totally, if you have passion, your tendency is to respond with emotion. But I also think if you're passionate enough, you realize that, much in the same way that we were taught to in high school and college, to address opposing views in like an argumentative paper, I think taking a moment to be like, okay, this is my opinion on this. What are some criticisms people might have of my opinion, and how do I feel about them? How do I adjust, what I have to say and my viewpoint based on that? And I think it makes for a stronger opinion. It makes for a stronger, more credible point that'll get across to more people if you take a moment to listen to all the voices involved. You know what I mean?
Yeah, but that also might just be a flaw in humanity that people tend to not be able to recognize when they might be wrong about something.
Oh, totally.
Myself excluded, because I've never been wrong about anything in my entire life.
Great.
But I have an innate sense to process information and know what is right and what is wrong. And most people don't have that, and they just go right ahead and share things without even thinking about it.
Yeah. Moving a little bit further down, like the...
You change the subject so quickly, it almost sounds like I'm not joking.
We could add in a laugh, or I'll just leave this part in. We know you're joking, Phil. The sarcasm comes through. But I wanted to move a little bit further down the chain of communication from the initial reaction to, verbal exchanges, and also ask you how you think word of mouth or even social media, I guess any person to person communication over time skews credibility, similar to like a real life version of the, childhood game telephone, where you each say a phrase and by the end of the circle, the phrase is completely different. But with real world information, what are your thoughts on that?
I mean, it's pretty straightforward. Like, you shouldn't trust something that came from someone that came from someone else that came from someone else.
Sure.
It's not even like admissible evidence in a courtroom. Like, you have firsthand witnesses, and then you have maybe secondary witnesses, but anything beyond that, it's just kind of like it isn't worth hearing or considering,
Right.
because stories change person to person.
Absolutely. Do you think there's this might be a very nuanced question, but do you think there's a direction in which information skews? Like, do you think it pulls towards a political polarization? Do you think information gets more and more exaggerated in general?
Yeah, I mean, I think it depends what it is. I mean, seems like we politicize almost everything today, but in general, people do tend to take more extreme points because they're more memorable. Like, they stick with you. Even if you want to take politics out of it,
Right.
if you listen to anyone that does sports talk or watch ESPN talk shows, anything like that, like, it's literally like, I'm going to give an example because I'm from Northeast Ohio. Baker Mayfield throws 2 interceptions in a game, and everyone's talking about he's the worst quarterback that's ever played. And, like, clearly he's not, but he's also not the greatest quarterback that ever played.
Right.
Like, Cleveland fans will lead you to believe. So, people are always going to tend towards the most extreme because it's what gets the most attention. The people that talk
Right.
the loudest. What's the phrase that squeaky wheel gets the oil or something like
Yeah.
that? Like, people are going to take things to the extreme because it's what's memorable.
Totally. And I feel like that's what drives a lot of gossip. Like, at times when I've noticed myself gossiping or watched other people, it's usually because you want to be the one in the room with the interesting story. Like, I don't even think gossip necessarily is malicious. It's just people talk, and, if you have something interesting to say, you're encouraged to say it. And that goes on with the news especially, but it's, financialized, if that's even a word.
Yeah, well, it is. I mean, that's kind of why we have, Fox News versus CNN, is just that people want to hear their confirmation bias, and it kind of justifies them to have these more extreme views or these more one-sided conversations and discussions and presentation of events.
Totally. And then one last philosophical information question before we get to our topic, because I also think this piece ties in, especially at the end of the episode. But do you agree with the phrase "history is written by the victors"?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I mean, I think that has a lot to do with our podcast theme is that,
Mm-hmm.
the more notable people are the ones that we remember because they're in the history books. Um, and even, I don't know, I was thinking about this the other day is that most of history that we think about is based around, and I'm talking old history here, but it's based around European world powers, China, maybe some India, Egypt, like these big, massive civilizations, and they only really account for a small percentage of the world.
Right.
But those are the ones that we hear about because they were the successful empires and nations, and they were the ones who were conquering other countries or other territories, and it almost seems like that's the only place that people lived in history, and that's just not how it is because you don't hear the other perspective of it.
Totally. Yeah, I definitely agree. I think to maybe transition a little bit into something closer to our topic today, a lot of the racial awareness that our country has gained over the last year is part of that kind of uncovering the, I don't want to call them the victors because it almost seems like that makes them the hero of the story, but the way we've dealt with our nation's history and teaching about it and talking about it has always been skewed in various ways to kind of uplift or glorify the US, as a freedom loving, benevolent entity.
I think to your point, the word victors doesn't necessarily mean good people.
Yeah.
Like
the most
it's the
powerful.
people that, yeah, really. And I guess that's kind of what this situation was, which of course we'll get into a lot more. But it's the people who basically destroyed the other group during the scene of history. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like, it's not saying that they were right or justified or that we should be supportive of what happened, but they were the ones who had a voice after the fact because they weren't completely wiped out.
Yeah. And I think maybe that's a good place to transition into our topic for today. So we're going to talk about a man named Maurice Willows, who was working for the Red Cross and responded to the Tulsa Race Riots. But I want to talk about the race riot first, especially because, if you haven't read about it this year, I'm sure everybody's heard about it this year if you've, not been living in a cave, because it's been mentioned in the news and it's been a part of our kind of pop social culture for the last 18 months or so. And I didn't know as much about it as I do now, having researched it, even though it's been featured in podcasts that I've listened to. But it was interesting to kind of get a little bit more thorough coverage on it. So I want to start talking about the race riot. And if you don't know, it's considered one of the worst incidents of racial violence in U.S. history. And as we talk about it and as we learn about it, it really was truly violent and horrible to a point where I'm taken aback by the fact that I didn't know about it. And I think that's maybe how a lot of people feel.
Yeah, I felt the same way too. I mean, I feel like I heard about it for the first time last year.
Yeah.
I'm sure I've crossed over it in history books or things that I've read, but until you sent me your plan for this episode, I really didn't know much about the Tulsa Race Riots, and I almost feel bad that I know so little about it going into this.
I think, some people might place the blame on the individual, but I also came across the fact during my research that it's not included in any of the major history book companies' textbooks. It's completely excluded from most professional, widely spread textbooks. And even people I know that grew up in Oklahoma, some of them didn't even learn about it, and they lived in the state and were educated in the state. So, I mean, I think it's good that everybody's taking a look at it, but it's more of a systemic problem, I think, than something individuals should feel bad about not knowing, if that makes any sense.
I don't want to jump the gun if you're going to get into this later, but why is that? Why isn't it taught?
I think the same reason that, in this country, at least in my experience and those that I've, shared with others and heard about others having, we all have this giant focus on the Holocaust during school. A lot of people had entire, programs dedicated to learning about the Holocaust. And not that we didn't need to, but we don't have that same kind of coverage for slavery, for American slavery and the slave trade. You hear about it, but it almost is this thing that you like pass through when you're learning about the Civil War. And
it's as simple as our common phrase that we're taught in school: slavery was bad, let's move on.
Yeah, and I think that's part of the history is taught by the victors and created by the victors, that it's a difficult type of history to learn about. It's hard, not to even take a smaller example. It's hard to admit to yourself when you've done something wrong. It's difficult to look inward and be honest when you've hurt somebody. And I think this is just a cultural, way more intense version of that. But I think that's, at the base, the root of the education problem is that it's not something that our culture is comfortable talking about on a widely spread basis.
Yeah, so I guess maybe it's just easier to talk about, Nazis and why they were wrong because we're not them.
Right.
When you say it's white Americans, it's a little more personal, closer to home.
When you're talking about the Holocaust, we're the good guys sort of in that story, right? Like we came to the rescue, and it positions America as the moral good guy, and slavery certainly does not. And I think that's why it's left out. And I mean, it's been 200 years in the making of, social stifling of the truth. And so I think it's just been a continuous process. But to start, I want to talk a little bit about Tulsa's Greenwood district, as that was the community that the race riots occurred in. After World War I, the Greenwood district, which was a section of Tulsa, Oklahoma, was nationally recognized for its affluent African-American community, where a thriving business district and surrounding residential area was actually referred to as Black Wall Street. And at the time, it was the nation's wealthiest Black community.
Do you know why? Like, why was all of the wealthy Black community in Tulsa? Seems like kind of a weird place.
Totally. So there's a lot of different kind of moving pieces that created this. The first is, and kind of what I found surprising, has to do with the Indian trade of African slaves. Because I was surprised to learn that the Indian tribes in Oklahoma, before it was a state and was just a territory, the Indian tribes did trade slaves. They bought and sold slaves. They owned, African American slaves, Black slaves. And that culture, though it was still slavery and they still didn't have freedom, the American Indian brand of slavery was much less destructive than the Southern white American version of slavery. For instance, American Indian tribes didn't separate families. They didn't, separate children or husband and wife. Usually, it was standard practice to sell families together. And it also was a little bit more of the condition of slavery gave a little bit more personal freedom. So slaves were taught to read. They were allowed to attend religious services together, and have community events. And this is a generalization. There were certainly more and or less brutal American Indian slave owners, but in general, Oklahoma was an area where a bit more cohesive culture was able to come out of enslaved people versus the South, where the entire culture was just continuously decimated. So there was, that caused a sort of flight of African Americans from the South into Oklahoma. And another part of it is we're talking just before the Civil War and during the Civil War. And a lot of people, especially in the North, hoped that Oklahoma and other states like it that were just kind of territories at this point, headed for statehood, they hoped that there would be a line that would prevent Jim Crow and slavery from continuing west. And we've talked about that on other episodes like Own a Judge with Thomas Jefferson, this idea that, okay, well, we have slavery over here, but we're not going to let it continue on our expansion.
Yeah.
And so I think that made Oklahoma sort of a destination for Black families, free Black families that had the choice. But it also, the enslaved black people that were already there were in a slightly better condition than those in the South. And so I think that led to a little bit more, we talk about history's compounding effects on communities and why, from slavery to Jim Crow to redlining, there's certain reasons why black communities are usually suffering more than white communities. But I think this was just a little minute version of that, where the black community in Tulsa was stronger than elsewhere and thus was able to build this. Another part of it was there were communities intentionally built when Oklahoma declared statehood. There were specific communities built to be black communities. It was part of segregation, but it was a part of segregation that benefited those communities, because the idea was they would have their own neighborhood where they would be free from what was called white surveillance and white control. And that, I think, is another thing that led to it being a little bit more successful, at least until the race riots.
I mean, so in kind of a way, not that this is a good thing or something we should be advocating for, but it was like the almost forced segregation was better for the black community. Not that, I don't mean that in a way that, like, African Americans would be better off if they were segregated, because that's just a result of, white oppression forcing them into these boxes where they could get away from white oppression.
Yeah.
If people were just decent humans and we didn't have this kind of clash between the races, we could kind of live in one community together, right, and should be successful for both. But the fact that they were able to get away from white oppressors in these pockets is what made, having these black communities better for African Americans.
Yeah, totally. And I think, we certainly don't advocate segregation, but it also wasn't just a white idea. There were plenty of, Black power, Black liberation movements that advocated for segregation for that reason, that very reason. We don't need you. Yeah. We don't need you here. We'll do it ourselves. Stay over there.
Right.
So anyway, to get back on track with our topic, there's this area in Greenwood, Black Wall Street, and it was thriving. It was about 35 city blocks, the wealthiest in the country, and it was a place where free black people had built wealth and owned property and owned homes and businesses. But unfortunately, that would soon, not necessarily, I guess effectively come to an end for at least a time. But on the morning of May 30th, 1921, a man named Dick Rowland, who was a 19-year-old black shoe shiner, was riding in the elevator with a white woman named Sarah Page, who was 17 years old and the elevator operator in Tulsa's Drexel building. Rowland was headed to the top floor of the building to use the colored restroom, which his employer had arranged for use by his black employees. Accounts of the event vary, and many are obviously highly suspect given the events that would follow, but the general story is that a clerk at Renberg's, which is a clothing store on the first floor of the Drexel building, heard what sounded like a woman's scream and saw a young black man running from the building. The clerk found Page in the elevator in a distraught state. Believing that she had been sexually assaulted, the clerk summoned authorities. Aside from the clerk's assumption that Page had been raped, other explanations were provided by bystanders, the most common being that Rowland had tripped as he stepped into the elevator and grabbed Page's arm to steady himself. Others believed that the two knew each other because they worked close by, and obviously Rowland would have been going into the building regularly to use the restroom. But others believed that they knew each other and were possibly even interracial lovers, which at the time was a dangerous and sometimes deadly taboo. And they believed that they were in the middle of what they called a lover's quarrel.
Is there any evidence to suggest that theory might hold weight, or was that purely just some story that someone made up to, I don't know, maybe justify this sexual assault claim?
It largely appears to be, like you said, word of mouth. This person told this person told this person. So it appears to be speculation mixed with word of mouth rumor spreading.
So these two wouldn't have known each other other than just he travels in the elevator sometimes.
I think given what I read, like I said, there's so many different accounts and everything's skewed because of the weight of what would follow. But the fact that the most common story given by multiple witnesses was that he tripped and grabbed her arm. That's what I feel most comfortable logically buying, just because it was corroborated at least by multiple sources instead of just some people believed this crazy story.
Right. I mean, I think that's a safe assumption if you don't know the story, is go with the simplest, most able to, prove or simplest explanation to what may have happened.
Well, and another part of this that makes me even more confident in that explanation is that later on, after the race riots, Sarah Page told authorities that Roland had grabbed her arm and nothing more. So even she...
Did she ever accuse him of more? Like when it first happened, or...
No.
So she wasn't like just recanting a story that she may have said earlier. She was literally clarifying the truth just a little bit too late.
Right. Totally. And, we don't know what happened in the elevator, right? It appears that nobody truly knows, except I suppose Sarah Page and Dick Rowland, but she, to authorities who were white and clearly would have been on her side, had nothing more to say than that he grabbed her arm. So I kind of... I buy that, and I buy that the bystanders were largely telling the truth who had that narrative as well. But unfortunately, nonetheless, Dick was accused of assaulting Sarah and was subsequently arrested. It's important to note that his charges were later dismissed and he was never charged for any crime. Of course, as we talked about at the beginning of the episode, people loved gossip and rumor, and the story of the alleged assault circulated throughout Tulsa's white community, becoming more and more exaggerated with each retelling. Rumors began to spread that Roland was going to be lynched, and this was a common occurrence at the time. The mobs of people with groupthink going on would all get up in a, fury over some rumor, and unfortunately... oftentimes it led to an innocent man, or possibly not innocent man, but nonetheless, no due process of law, just, a lynching in the public square.
I will say, when I was researching questions for your quiz at the end, I almost asked you a question about lynching, and then I looked it up, and it was just, it's such a hard subject to read about.
Yeah.
And I was just, that's kind of, I mean, there's going to be a lot of gruesome graphic stuff in this episode, but I think this is the only time that we talk about lynching, and I just didn't want to bring it back up because it's sad. It's sick to read some of the stuff that, how black people were treated. And it wasn't entirely exclusively black people, but predominantly the way that black people were treated was just it's really hard to read and comprehend that.
When they had actually the community of Tulsa had just lynched a white man a couple months before this.
Yeah.
And so people totally bought that, like, they were going to lynch a black guy. They just killed a white guy in the public square. Like, so it was totally believable. And I think that comes into play in a moment, because you can't really blame the black community for believing that they were going to lynch Roland, because it happened all the time. Mm-hmm. So all of this happens. Roland is being held at the jail, and these rumors start circulating. So on May 31st, the day after the alleged assault, after hearing reports that a mob of hundreds of white men had gathered around the jail where Roland was being held, a group of 75 black men, some of whom were armed, arrived at the jail to protect him from the rumored lynching. The sheriff in Tulsa, of course, encouraged the group to leave the jail with the assurance that he had the situation under control and had barricaded Roland in the top floor of the jail for his protection. Now, I find it curious that he was trying to encourage the group of 75 black men to leave, but not the giant white crowd.
Is it possible that we just don't have the whole story? Like, he was probably telling everyone to leave.
Possibly.
If he had barricaded Roland for his own protection. I mean, who knows? I'm not trying to say it was one or the other, but it's possible that we were only talking about him sending the black people.
Yes, it could have been both. You're right. So eventually the group acquiesced, and as they were leaving, an elderly white man approached O.B. Mann, a black man, and demanded he hand over his pistol. O.B. Mann refused, and the old man attempted to disarm him. In the scuffle, Mann shot him, and then, according to the sheriff's report, all hell broke loose. So Obi-Man is, trying to defend himself from being disarmed by this white man and accidentally shoots him, and gunfire breaks out. After the smoke had cleared, 12 people were dead, 10 white and 2 black. Outnumbered, of course, the African Americans began retreating back into the Greenwood district where they had come from. So at this point, the accounts that I've read, it almost resembles like an old Western gunfight where people are just running through the streets, shooting at each other. At multiple points, and I'll say this again later, throughout this 24-hour period, there were standoffs in the streets of Tulsa between black and white citizens with weapons. And so it really did kind of turn into a war zone for the 2 days that this happened. As news of the violence at the jail spread throughout the city, mob violence broke out. The local government response to the outbreak failed to calm or contain the situation. In fact, much of the response simply added to the chaos. Municipal and county officials selected several men as deputies, all white, and some participants in the very riot they were supposed to be calming down. Rather than uphold their duties to establish order and protect property, the deputies added to the destruction, often committing acts that were themselves illegal, such as burning or destroying homes and businesses in Greenwood. Public officials also distributed firearms and ammunition to citizens, again all white men, because everybody knows the best way to calm a riot down is to distribute weapons to the rioters, right?
Yeah, I mean, we talk about this all the time. The only way to stop a bad guy with a gun is a good guy with a gun. Or,
yeah, it's just like so ridiculous.
Like
what?
More guns.
More than anything else that the city did, that is the most, I think, that act of distributing weapons to the white group that was already starting to riot makes them the most complacent. Like, it's not like it even looks like they tried to be neutral. They were just like, oh man, they're all shooting at each other. Here's guns.
I mean, it's easy to pinpoint and be like, yeah, the police or officials or government, whoever it was helping the white people by giving them guns. But they probably literally thought that this would solve the riot. Like, they would say, oh, if they all have guns, then the black people would just go back to Greenwood and it'll be over. Like, someone legitimately thought that was going to be a solution and wasn't just saying, go kill them all, here's guns.
Either way, the community of Greenwood is going to be in for a long evening. But before we get to that, we're going to take a short break and we'll be right back.
Matt, you like coffee, right?
I love coffee.
Would you ever want to buy me a coffee?
Anytime, Phil. Just say the word.
Our dedicated listeners could also buy me a coffee.
Could they buy me a coffee as well?
They could buy you a coffee.
This sounds fantastic.
We set up this service called Buy Me a Coffee at buymeacoffee.com/historiesbside.
And people can buy us a coffee?
Yeah. It's really just a way for people to support the show if they enjoy the show. And if they're listening to the show, we sure hope you enjoy it.
Yeah, otherwise you're just, wasting your time.
At buymeacoffee.com/historiesbside, there's 3 ways that our listeners can interact with the show. Number 1, you can just donate to the show by clicking Buy Them a Coffee.
2, you can join as a member for $10 a month or $100 a year. Being a member gains you some pretty cool perks. You get access to our monthly bonus episode, History's B-Side Battles, access to our future episode queue, a name shout-out on a future episode. We'll also send you a handwritten thank you postcard and sticker set, and more perks will be announced as we continue on.
There's also some different extras that people can get on our Buy Me a Coffee website. Things like choosing the topic for a future episode. If there's a lesser-known person in history that you have an interest in, let us know and we'll do an episode all about them. You can also buy sets of custom postcards, sticker sets, and future merchandise that we add on there as well. Or you can draft your own advertisement script and we will promote whatever you want in a segment like this.
The website again is buymeacoffee.com/historiesbside.
Matt?
Yeah.
You owe me a coffee.
Oh. Do I get a coffee too?
You're buying.
All right.
All right, welcome back. So we left off with the city of Tulsa experiencing this violent outbreak at the jail in response to Rowland's arrest and the subsequent exchange of gunfire, with Black residents retreating back into the community of Greenwood while being pursued by white rioters, and the city not really responding very well. And so what would follow is what we refer to as the Tulsa Race Riots. And before I describe some of the acts that were committed, I do want to give a graphic content warning to anybody who doesn't want to listen to the next section. It's brutal, it's gruesome, and yeah, I guess that's all I'll say about it. If you find that sort of thing triggering, it might be best to just move the episode forward a minute or two.
Probably don't have anyone that listens with their kids, but you never know.
But I found it important to include because it really does outline just how horrific and violent this was. And for me, the sheer graphicness and brutality of the attack is what really made it kind of surprising and even more sorrowful that we don't talk about this event. But following the exchange of gunfire on the night of May 31st and following into the morning of June 1st, the white rioters brutally attacked Greenwood residents, using bricks, clubs, and firearms, including machine guns. Some drove cars through the streets, firing bullets indiscriminately into homes and businesses, while others threw makeshift bombs and lit oil rags into Greenwood buildings. And eyewitness accounts even indicate that retired World War I aircraft were used to firebomb parts of the community, with rioters riding in planes with rifles and throwing bombs from the planes. When rumors spread of Black militants heading to Tulsa by train, the rioters actually riddled a passing locomotive with bullets, leaving innocent passengers terrified and ducking for cover on the floor. Another particularly graphic eyewitness account describes seeing bodies being dragged by noose behind cars through the streets of Greenwood.
Where did they get World War I aircraft?
I mean, they were simply aircraft that belonged to white members of the community. Some of them were retired from war and were being used for agricultural reasons. Obviously, this is a couple years after World War I ended, so there would be all of these aircraft kind of being sold and, being taken on for other uses than warfare. So members of the community owned planes and apparently felt the need to use them.
It's just crazy. Like, I understand that people are very passionate and there's probably a lot of rage, especially when they think that he maybe raped or assaulted a teenage white girl. Listen, we know from our past lens that that's probably not what happened. But when we're talking about taking in these rumors and information spreading quickly, like, I can understand why people would be that upset about it. But to completely destroy a community and just murder tons of people,
Right.
destroy businesses, destroy homes, seems like a bit of overkill.
Well, totally. And there's a lot of, in my research, there was a lot of talk about the importance of what word you use to describe this. And, using the term massacre versus riot. And this doesn't look at all like a riot anymore. That's why I wanted to read some of these descriptions, because people are riding through the streets in cars, 4 deep, all with rifles, some with machine guns, throwing bombs and lighting buildings on fire. There were talk of snipers in church towers. This isn't a riot. This resembles a World War II battle in the middle of France at this point. They're flying planes and dropping bombs from the planes. This is a war. This is warfare. It's not a riot. I don't know what you can't call it the Tulsa Race War. I guess you could, or the Tulsa Race Battle, but this is not, I don't feel like this is still a riot anymore.
I'm just rolling my eyes at the certain percentage of the population right now that would describe this as it's a peaceful protest.
Well, it's like, especially given our context today, where we've talked a lot in the last year about what qualifies as a peaceful protest and when is it too violent and when is civil disobedience just crime. But like, can you imagine?
When you're using aircraft, it goes a little beyond
Can you
civil
imagine,
disobedience.
like, I'm sitting here recording this in Portland. Can you imagine if there were, like, Antifa airplanes and they were throwing Molotov cocktails over the city of Portland? Like, what Fox News would have to say about that? Good Lord.
And that's really not even like, none of that, I guess, compares to the account seeing bodies being dragged by noose behind cars, which again could be just a count and not something that actually happened. But it's not that far-fetched to imagine that that was happening based on everything else that was going on during this. And that's really kind of a gross vision of what was happening here.
Yeah, it's truly like that. The scene that I tried to set with the description, I think, displays the absolute worst of humanity and humanity's behavior. Even worse than warfare. I mean, we hear about warfare, there being honor and laws and rules. Like, you don't, you're you're killing the other side,
crimes.
but you almost respect the other side. This is a complete dehumanization, dragging bodies behind cars and just firing into homes. You're not, like, there's no delineation between militants and civilians. There's no thought of, like, this community needs to still exist when we're done. And so, I mean, it truly is mind-bending and mind-blowing that it got this bad this fast. In less than a day, it went from people standing outside a courthouse to warfare.
And like you said, it wasn't just, men versus men. Like, there were children involved.
Yeah.
There were children in these houses and people storming into their homes and destroying what was theirs too, like their families. And I don't know if you have it in the episode, but I've read accounts about kids that were cowering under their tables or in closets because of people coming through their houses and destroying their property. Like, that's just unbelievable. We wouldn't do that in war we shouldn't do that in war to civilians of other countries, let alone other Americans.
Well, and it was so disorganized and frantic, and I don't know what word to use to describe it, but white rioters killed white people. There were dozens of white casualties that we know came from white gunfire. They were just shooting everybody. Like, I mean, it's insane how, I don't know. I don't understand how a group of human beings can get to this point this quickly, other than through pure hatred.
Yeah.
While black residents did attempt to defend the community from the attack, squaring off at multiple points with white rioters in several gunfights, they were simply outnumbered. The attack ended up destroying more than 35 blocks of the Greenwood district. Over 190 businesses, a junior high school, a library, several churches, and Greenwood's only hospital were completely destroyed. More than 800 people were admitted to hospitals in the region for injuries. Over 6,000 black residents, and this is the part that creates so much cognitive dissonance for me. Over 6,000 black residents were arrested and detained by local authorities and the Oklahoma National Guard, who marched detainees at gunpoint through the streets to internment camps where many were held for several days. So you've got white rioters, and of course, the black community was defending itself and firing back, and that, nobody should be shooting guns, but they just arrested the whole community of Greenwood, and none of the rioters at any point were ever tried or prosecuted or arrested. The solution, that paired with the earlier statement that they handed out guns, it just makes me like what solution were you looking for here other than the complete ruin of this community? So 6,000 black residents arrested, which is almost the entire community at this point. And due to the destruction, a staggering 10,000 people were left homeless. Estimates of the time put the death toll around 36. There were various estimates from news sources that ranged in the mid double digits. But a 2001 report by the Oklahoma Commission to study the Tulsa Race Riots of 1921 suggests the actual count is likely somewhere between 100 and 300 people, mostly black. Estimates of white casualties lie in the lower double digits. So we don't really know how many people were killed during this, mostly because of, like I said, the dehumanization of the black community there was overwhelming, and there were accounts of even people, and this was pure speculation as well, but there were accounts that, you know, black people were being forced to dig mass graves, and they've actually looked for these grave sites with radar at present time to try to find them to get an actual count. But of course, at the time, the downplaying by the local authorities and local press put the death count at 36. The Tulsa Real Estate Exchange estimated property losses amounting to $1.5 million in real estate and $750,000 in personal property. And in total, this would equate to about $31 million as of 2017. As I said, none of the criminal acts committed that I described above during the riot were ever prosecuted or punished by government at any level, municipal, county, state, or federal. Even after the violence had come to a close, black detainees could only be released with an application by a white citizen, and only if that white citizen took full legal responsibility for the detainee's behavior once released.
Do you know what that means? Like, I guess I don't really understand why. I'm sure there were some white allies, but why would any white citizen do this? Like, why would they make themselves responsible for anything that the black person did?
Right. Well, I think that was the point. It was so that there wasn't a reason to release them. Eventually, I think once national attention caught on and other people became involved, they were pretty much forced to release these people from internment camps that had been arrested for virtually no reason. But I think that was the point, was to basically make it impossible for these people to be released. Why a white person would take full legal responsibility unless they were like a hell of an ally is beyond me. It did happen. There were several community members that were, you know, especially a handful of wealthy white community members that did step in and tried to help rebuild with their own personal property and finances. And so there were people that were interested in helping after the fact. But I think the entire point of this weird condition was that black detainees wouldn't be released.
Yeah.
Again, acting more complacent in the destruction of Greenwood than protective of its citizens, Tulsa officials actually turned away offers of outside aid. Several white individuals, as I said, from Tulsa and surrounding communities offered assistance to the city's black population, which was now almost entirely homeless. The Oklahoma National Guard actually demanded that the black residents of Greenwood perform the cleanup and rebuilding of their community. And as I said, some sources indicate that about 37 black residents were hired as gravediggers and ordered to dig graves in which to bury over 100 of their deceased neighbors, without coffins. The only organization to provide aid to the decimated community of Greenwood came from the American Red Cross, which at the time was intended only for response to natural and not man-made disasters. The decision to intervene was made by the director of Red Cross Relief, a man by the name of Maurice Willows, who is our topic for today.
Finally.
So I will say now, as a caveat, or I guess I want to qualify that this episode's a little bit different than our other ones, because we usually spend a little bit of time talking about the background and a lot of time talking about the person. This one's different in that it's going to be flip-flopped because there's not much known about Maurice Willows. There's only 2 websites online that significantly describe his life, his biography, and honestly, there's not much there as far as a biography. It's mostly just, you know, his contribution to the Red Cross relief effort. So, Maurice Willows was born in Clinton, Kansas in 1876, and to give you an idea of just how spotty and lacking information on him is, he might have been born in Clinton, Ontario, because there were some sources that indicated that he was born in Canada and others that say he was born in Kansas. So the official biography that I read stated that he was born in Clinton, Kansas, so that's going to be our official stance.
You just got to say he was born in Clinton, and then there's a skip in the podcast and do it on the second half of that word.
Yeah. And like I said, very little is known about his early life, or any of his life really, beyond his work during the Tulsa Race Riots relief effort, hence the slightly reversed format of today's episode. In 1921, when the race riot broke out, Willows was working at the Red Cross Center in St. Louis, Missouri, when he received a letter informing him of the terrible event in Tulsa. Willows was the first Red Cross official to arrive in Tulsa to investigate the race riot's aftermath.
So is Willows white or black?
Willows was white.
Okay, so he's obviously a little more progressive than the general people of Tulsa.
Of Tulsa, yeah, clearly. Yeah.
Do you know anything about, I mean, you obviously haven't gotten too much on his biography, but do you know anything about like where he was from? Like, were they a little bit more integrated, or was it still kind of racial violence in St. Louis, or I guess Clinton?
Yeah. I would imagine, I don't know much about it. This is purely me inferring from things I've read in the past and this research for this episode, but I would imagine that St. Louis was in a similar place as Tulsa. St. Louis would have been, I think, a bigger city at the time, but I imagine they had much the same issues with race and tension on that basis. As far as his hometown of Clinton, Kansas, was much smaller, and so I imagine that it was probably a primarily white community. But I also think it's worth mentioning that somebody who works for a nonprofit like the Red Cross is probably already predisposed to have a little bit more of an empathetic, compassionate, helping people personality.
Yeah, you tend to hope that humanitarians are, concerned about humanity.
Yeah. And he did, I mean, it is, I think he did have a more progressive view, because there were points at which he argued with the city of Tulsa later on about providing aid and about providing housing. And he even got into it with several public officials who were trying to delay the rebuilding and reconstruction of the community. Once he arrived in Tulsa, seeing the destruction and dire need for medical aid and assistance, Willows phoned the Red Cross headquarters in Washington, D.C., urging that the event be classified as a natural disaster so that aid could be provided.
Were there any specific grounds to classify it as a quote-unquote natural disaster? Like, did he need to meet certain qualifications to get aid?
Well, that's I guess the funny thing about it is, you imagine that a group like the Red Cross could just be like, you know what, we're going to provide aid because we want to. And that's kind of what they ended up doing here. But at the time, the idea of a natural disaster was kind of exactly what it sounds like. Anything caused by nature. Mm-hmm. So they didn't respond to, like today they respond to refugee crises caused by warfare or invasions or genocide. They didn't do that at this time. They were primarily engaged in rebuilding communities and providing aid for, hurricane relief, tornadoes, natural things. They called it divine providence, things that happened outside of the control of humanity.
Right.
And this was firmly, obviously, not in that realm, as the entire thing had been maybe not orchestrated, but performed by humanity. During this call, Willows stated, quote, "There is an unknown number of homeless refugees, all Negroes, and there is no adequate relief organization in town on account of the division between whites and Negroes." So he recognized that there was nobody coming to help the people of Tulsa. The director of the Red Cross granted Willows' request and instructed him to fully respond to the situation however he saw fit.
I'm a little surprised that they just gave him the green light. I guess the reason I was asking about that earlier is just that you would think that a nonprofit has some specific restrictions that they need to operate within, especially if they're funded by government dollars or donations. But right. I assume that, the Red Cross, like we said, is a humanitarian organization, is probably a little bit more progressive than maybe the typical person as far as their racial attitudes, and specifically what was happening in Tulsa.
Right. Absolutely. And I think at some point, people like Willows and the director of the Red Cross probably realized, like, our mission is to provide aid to people in need who are suffering. And that's what this was. And I think, at least to me, a sensible person would be like, it doesn't really matter what caused this. Like, these people are still homeless and their community is destroyed, whether it was a tornado, a hurricane, or a mob. I don't know that the emphasis or importance lies in what caused it.
Right.
And their response was very quick. Within 24 hours of this call, the Red Cross had established a makeshift hospital and a school in Greenwood. An eyewitness account of the scene at the hospital describes the horrible violence. Quote, "I can never erase the sights of my first visit to the hospital. There were men wounded in every conceivable way, like soldiers after a large battle. Some had amputated limbs, burned faces, others minus an eye, or with their heads completely bandaged." End quote. So, my comparison to this as an actual battle, as warfare, isn't far off. And you can imagine if people are, throwing bombs, that the carnage would be like this. So the Red Cross got to work at their hospital. Their nurses performed 451 surgeries, vaccinated 841 people for tetanus, typhoid, and smallpox, prepared meals for 144 children, and treated 125 people for dysentery.
I mean, all this is like sad, but it's really impressive how quickly they got this set up and were able to treat so many people. Like, the speed is super impressive.
Absolutely. And within 24 hours having these both set up, the Red Cross was there for months after the riot. So I don't know if all of these things, the surgeries and vaccinations, happened, within a week or whatever. It might have been over the course of those months. But yeah, the speed to get this all prepared and set up is incredible. And I think partially due to Willows' leadership. He was able to secure $100,000 in funding to mount a sustained relief effort, and got it so that the city of Tulsa had to pay about $40,000 of that. So he kind of coerced. I don't want to use the word coerced because I don't know much about the nature of how he went about it, but the city of Tulsa was made to be at least partially financially responsible for the cleanup effort. He also worked to build a more permanent housing plan for the thousands of homeless residents, trading in the Red Cross tents for more livable established buildings in September of 1921. So this kind of gives you an idea of how long they were there. I mean, people were living in tents from June to September until they built more sustainable wooden housing.
Wow.
As I said, the American Red Cross would remain in Tulsa for 7 months following the riot, and was the sole official source of relief effort under Willows' command. His leadership in securing resources and aid for those affected by the riot not only saved thousands from illness, homelessness, and in many cases death, but set a precedent for the Red Cross's future humanitarian efforts, expanding their mission to cover more than just natural disasters. In fact, their mission statement now today begins more broadly with the phrase, quote, "to prevent and alleviate human suffering," end quote. So, in addition to being the catalyst for what ended up being the only effort at relieving the community of Greenwood and rebuilding, also set this precedent for the Red Cross that they would no longer just focus on natural disasters, but just work on helping humans that are suffering.
That's cool that he kind of reshaped the Red Cross. We're obviously talking about his accomplishment to the Tulsa Massacre, but he kind of changed the Red Cross too, which is an organization that we're all very familiar with.
Right. He kind of set the stage for them to, just like a legal precedent would change the way a law was thought about. He changed the way the Red Cross approached their mission. And, today, of course, the Red Cross does all kinds of things. They work with refugees of war, like I said, of genocide. They don't just focus on natural disasters anymore. And that helped shape them into the humanitarian powerhouse that they are today.
Do you have any idea what the Greenwood community is like today, or how it's changed in the 100 years since?
Yes. So, in fact, by the 1940s and 50s, Greenwood had bounced back. It began to thrive again as a primarily black community where wealth was centered, and actually made it back to the point where it was again considered one of the wealthiest black communities in the country. Unfortunately, like many black communities today, it was affected by gentrification, and specifically in the 70s, they actually built an interstate highway right over the community. So today, Greenwood is still there. It's still a center of black culture in Tulsa, but there's only about one block of businesses left that are still open and still thriving, given how much the community was destroyed by the highway. And the city also rezoned a lot of what used to be Greenwood for industrial use. And like I said, all the other lovely things that come with gentrification have continually affected the community.
Has there been any other kinds of, I guess, racial events, whether good or bad, in Tulsa? I guess what kind of sparked the Tulsa massacre in my brain was last year, when obviously a lot of campaigning shut down in an election year because of the pandemic. And we went through the whole, Black Lives Matter movement, and we had all kinds of rallies and protests, and if you want to call them riots, across the country. And then when Trump decided to start campaigning again amid the pandemic, his first rally was planned for Tulsa. And there was this whole outcry over the fact that granted, Trump received a lot of criticism for things, deserved or not, but people were saying, how can he start campaigning in this city where the Tulsa massacre took place? And that was where I was like, well, what was that about? And I tried to read a little bit into it. So I don't know. I'm not saying that was a racial incident, that he had a campaign rally there, but has there been any back and forth, or maybe any kind of reconciliation since this took place between the Black community and white Americans?
There definitely is still a fair degree of racial tension there. Obviously, there are Black communities and white communities there. It's also in Oklahoma, which is a fairly red-leaning state, fairly rural state. I think personally, and we could debate about this all day, but I personally believe that it was intentional that Trump chose it because it would get the attention it got. But today in the city, it's interesting. There's a lot going on, that there's just so many different voices. For instance, this spring, there was planned a concert in commemoration for the 100-year, if you want to call it, anniversary of the race riot. That was pretty contentious. A lot of people felt that the money that was being spent to hold this concert and commemoration, it was just kind of like I don't know what the word you want to use is, but not enough, I suppose. It didn't treat the problem. It was a symbolic but kind of hollow and empty attempt to quell some of the pressure in the community. But a lot of the more progressive folks are actually asking for financial reparations for what happened. I mean, we talked about 31 million in loss in today's money, and that has been a huge conversation in Tulsa, as it has been throughout the entire country. At this point, the city hasn't done anything directly related to financially recompensating survivors or survivors' descendants. There is a bill that was introduced in the Oklahoma Congress for, to provide an avenue for reparations, but there wasn't a lot of information on what that would look like. But a lot of the backlash about the commemoration, because it kind of took me aback at first that this event that was meant to memorialize the suffering that went on in 1921 was criticized by the Black community, but it was criticized on that basis because, they're spending all of this money to have a concert and bring in celebrities to perform at the concert and not sending any of that money to the Black community. So like you said, it seems kind of hollow.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I don't think that I can be someone who can speak for what the right thing to do is. It does seem like something that should be maybe memorialized a bit, or at least educated in the public eye. Like, it's a pretty big moment in American history that I would be willing to bet that a very large percentage of Americans don't know took place, or if they've heard of it, they don't know anything about it. So yeah, I mean, it's a part of our history, for better or for worse. Just kind of a sad moment, and the fact that it's not talked about is sad.
But Maurice Willows, to end on a positive note, Maurice Willows, I think we can say in our new tradition, is, I think, definitively a good person.
Yeah. I mean, I don't see how we could knock that. We We definitely don't know anything bad about him, but he seemed to step into the moment in the right way and at least led the charge to begin trying to make the situation right in the ways that he could. And just the fact that these actions kind of reshaped the Red Cross is impressive on its own, because we know how effective they are as an organization. And if they had been, not reaching out to situations like this, it would be much different than how we perceive them now. Well, should we get into the quiz?
Yeah, I think I'm ready. I don't know how well I'm going to do, but there's not a lot of information on Maurice.
It might be kind of tough, but we'll see.
We'll be right back.
All right, now we're going to get into today's quiz section. We like to end every episode with just a short 3-question quiz to kind of test today's host, see how much he's studied in and around his topic, and maybe you, the listener, as you're following along, have heard some of these and might be able to answer it yourselves. So we're going to get into a few questions here that aren't about Maurice Willows per se, because like you said, there really isn't a whole lot on him specifically, but they do relate to the Tulsa Race Riots and the Red Cross. So we'll see how you do.
Yeah, I feel good.
I think one I tried to make pretty easy. One you might get from studying. I'd be impressed if you got all 3, but they're doable if you read enough on this.
All right.
We'll start with your easiest one, which is about the Red Cross. And I tried to make this easy so that you would be able to get one for sure. And there's some context clues in the question. So I really hope that you get it. Oh, and also I have a theme for these quizzes, or at least this quiz section, which is people that could be B-siders.
Okay.
Not all of your answers are going to be like names, but they're all connected to a name of someone who kind of fits the theme of important to history, or at least a specific part of history or unique story that maybe just isn't very well known. All right, you ready?
Yes.
All right, easy question. The American Red Cross, which was founded on May 21st, 1881, was inspired by and is a member of the International Committee of the Red Cross, an independent, neutral organization founded in 1863 by a humanitarian from what country?
Oh, God. Oh, no.
Think about it. It's pretty simple.
1863, Red Cross. I feel like it's somewhere in Europe. I think I'm going to go with France.
Oh, you got Europe right, but it's right
Italy?
there. No. Switzerland.
Oh, duh. Oh my God. I'm dumb. That is so, that is such, I was like, that makes me so
Think
mad.
about the flag, independent, neutral organization.
I was thinking more like Catholic, and I know it's not a Catholic organization, which was probably where I went wrong, but I was thinking cross Catholic. Dang
it
it.
was founded by a man named Henry Dunant. I'm not sure if I said that right. I didn't look it up, but I actually might add him to my list of future episodes. I just need to maybe look up some more about him, but he actually helped wounded soldiers at the Battle of Solferino in 1859, and then lobbied political leaders to take more action and protect war victims. So he actually founded this International Committee of the Red Cross, which was sort of modified to the International Committee of the Red Crescent by the Ottoman Empire, and the two have sort of formed to be, sometimes you'll see the joint logos of the Red Cross and the Red Crescent, but it's a big global organization of which the American Red Cross is a part of.
Gotcha. Dang it. I didn't get my easy one right. This isn't boding well for me.
Question number 2 is about the Greenwood District. This is the one that I would be most surprised if you got right, but if you read enough on the topic, you might be able to get it. So, following the massacre, it took about 10 years to rebuild the Greenwood District. There is one building, which is the last remaining structure from the time that the massacre took place and still stands today. Do you know what the building is?
I don't know the name of it, but I'm going to say it's a church.
Yeah, I'll give you credit. It's the Vernon AME Church, which is the African Methodist Episcopal, Vernon African Methodist Episcopal Church. It was founded by O.W. Gurley, who is the man who essentially built and funded the entire Greenwood district. Pretty wealthy man who basically purchased the plot of land and built a lot of the structures that ended up being there. All right. And your final question. I bet you at least read this name. This is the only one that'll be an actual person you need to name. But I bet you've at least read this name, even if you might not remember in the moment. But who was the last known living witness of the Tulsa Massacre?
Oh, gosh. I watched an interview of him. Unless it's not a him, then I didn't watch the last.
Him.
Dang it. I watched an interview of a surviving witness to the massacre then. I don't know. I have no idea.
So the woman's name was Olivia Hooker. She was 6 years old when a group of white men carrying torches broke into her Greenwood home and began destroying her belongings. But later in life, in 1945, Hooker became the first African-American woman to join the U.S. Coast Guard, and then she went on to earn a doctorate degree in psychology and helped form the Tulsa Race Riot Commission in 1997 to investigate the massacre and make a case for reparations. She passed away in November of 2018 at the age of 103.
Wow. Centenarian. That's pretty cool. She would be an awesome B-sider.
Yeah. So maybe that's someone that we want to look at for a future episode, at least as far as a cool story. I also did come across two potential survivors, a 107-year-old survivor named Viola Fletcher and a 106-year-old survivor named Leslie Benningfield Randall. I don't know if they're still alive or know much about their backgrounds. I just kind of came across their names, but this Olivia Hooker was definitely confirmed. And I found an NPR interview that she did where she talked about her experience in the Tulsa massacre, as a child. And she was really interesting to kind of hear that perspective.
Yeah, no, that would be a really cool episode.
So, I mean, you did okay. You're at least familiar with
I got one. I sort of got one. I'll take it.
This was a tough one. I had a hard time finding specific questions that weren't very, very specific about the actual event.
Right.
And of course, nothing on our Maurice Willows.
Right. Yeah. No, I pretty much put everything I could about Maurice into this episode because I was like, I'm going to talk about him for 5 minutes and the rest of the episode is going to be about the race riot.
Well, it's a good thing for people to know, something that isn't taught very much.
Yeah. As always, we really appreciate your support and listening to our podcast. We certainly enjoy putting it together for you and hope you enjoy listening. As we said before, please feel free to reach out to us with any questions, comments, concerns, or ideas that you'd like to share with us via email at historiesbside@gmail.com, or you can find us on social media at historiesbside.
Thanks for listening.
History's B-Side is an independent, listener-supported podcast.
Leave us a review or subscribe to the show on your favorite podcasting service, and follow along on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram at History's B-Side.
Send us your feedback or inquire about sponsorship and advertising opportunities by emailing us at historiesbside@gmail.com.
You can donate to the show at buymeacoffee.com/historiesbside. While you're there, check out our membership perks, merchandise, and more.
This episode was researched and produced by your hosts, Matt Melito
and Phil Hall. Thanks for listening to History's B-Side.